Hi everyone, I'm Sitian Chen. I'm a PhD candidate at the Institution of Education, University College London. And in my master's dissertation, I explored Chinese women's verbal participation experience at British University. And I use feminist intersectionality to try to promote their voices. So today, I want to discuss how using feminist approaches can help in understanding the experience of marginalized international students in higher education research, based on my experience of doing my master's. And so my presentation consists of 4 parts. We'll start by looking at the challenge we face when researching international students through the lens of feminist approaches. And then I'll briefly introduce key aspects of feminist approaches in doing research. And then explain how this can be applied to international student research and how they can challenge international traditional research methods. So finally, I'll share my expectation for future research based on the idea we have just discussed. So the title of my presentation, Why It's So Quiet, is a question that people might often ask international students. So let's first re-examine why some international students seem invisible in our increasingly internationalized classroom from the perspective of feminist approaches. So I have summarized 3 key points of the challenge we are facing. The first one is the representation challenge. Marginalized international students, for example, women and LGBTQ+ students, were represented as inferior or significant only in a way they serve dominant groups' interests in some research. The second one is the knowledge production. Knowledge that is not useful for students in subordinate position is producing or that reinforce gender and other social hierarchies. And the third one is execution of voices. Women and gender minority voices are excluded in some research process. So as a Chinese intern student who has conducted research with this group, I'll use Chinese international students as an example to further elaborate on this issue. So in terms of the representation challenge and knowledge production, the East Asian students, including Chinese students, are often characterized as silent or passive, especially compared to, say, Western students. So the first characteristic that some studies remark on is that anxiety, low confidence, and nervousness are noted among Chinese students when they're speaking English. And other than language barriers, some research also focus on the characteristic of East Asian culture. They emphasize the strong impact of Confucian values on understanding Chinese people. Like, for example, Chinese students, especially Chinese women, embody Confucian values like being obedient and quiet. And this also reinforces the stereotypes of masculinity and femininity, which continue to undermine Chinese women students' voices and their participation in universities. And some research also highlights that East Asian students use face-saving strategy to avoid humiliation. East Asian student applies, and they're more likely to show respect to teachers. But attributing these linguistic and cultural trails to East Asian culture can lead to stereotyping East Asian students. And these trails are viewed as typical Oriental or feminine in Western cultural patriarchy, serving the interests of dominant groups while not trying to support and understand them from students' perspective. And in terms of how gender play a role in international students' learning, gender differences are observed, but in some research tends to overlook the international difference within Chinese international students groups. International students as a group are very diverse, but women, gender minorities, disabled students, and students from different social classes are often underrepresented, and their experience are not considered as valuable as dominant groups. Then how feminist approach can help address these issues? Feminist approaches are diverse in their emphasis and specific methods. Feminist approaches usually consist of core features. Currently, some research still overlook women and other gender minorities experience and reproduce gender power relations, suppressing and silencing them. In contrast, the feminist approaches seek to respect, understand, and empower women and gender minority in research. So in order to reach this goal, feminist approaches re-examine the epistemology. So it is worth noticing that researching topic directly related to gender doesn't necessarily require the use of feminist approaches. Conversely, feminist approaches can be applied to research unrelated to gender, like research with international students. So I would like to highlight three feminist epistemology here: standpoint theory, intersectionality, and a queer theory. Well, there are many other valuable feminist theories, and I have chosen this for based on my research experience. So let's first look at the standpoint theory. So feminist standpoint theories acknowledge the influence of context and perspective of research. Therefore, they fundamentally disrupt the notion of objective and value-free science. Particularly, women's experience have been framed within and interpreted by the dominant. So they began to inquire with the experience of individuals who are not members of dominant groups, with the goal of opening up different ways of understanding by foregrounding marginalized voice. So in the research with international students, we desire more voices from marginalized international students themselves, particularly from women and gender minorities, to stop viewing them as inferior. And I also want to present folks from my participation in my master dissertation when they talk about their feelings toward verbal participation at British University. Although I didn't verbally participate, I could hear other people's in-depth ideas, as well as the teacher's explanation. I actually gained a lot from class. And one participant also challenged my research question, suggesting that girls may have more enthusiasm for speaking than boys. So they're not necessarily incompetent in learning when using English, nor they just passively obey the cultural or gender norms. Listening to their voices reveal like the power of their learning experience. However, like feminist standpoint theory, it's also not value-free, and it was also critiqued for only speaking of certain women, like Western middle class heterosexual women. So in this case, in the case where our research participants are already a minority in the context, we must still be aware that our research may only reflect the interests of, for example, like heterosexual middle class students. We need to bear in mind that, for example, the experience of one group of women cannot replace those of another group. And that's why I would like to emphasize feminist intersectionality and queer theories. The intersectionality refers to a critical insight that characteristic or identities such as class, disability, gender, ethnicity, and age do not separately operate as independent entities, but rather are reciprocally constructing phenomena. So I think this is also mentioned by many other colleagues. Intersectionality can be effective in studying people who are characterized by multiple identity in a complex context. But I also want to highlight a gender identity. So in my presentation, some Chinese women also identify themselves as acquired as traditional views. But when they talk about their experience in the classroom, bossy boys are also constantly mentioned by them. I noticed that cultural norms and gender norms may might enforce a giant suppression of Chinese women at British University. the situation of international students who hold multiple identities is more complicated and harder to understand from a single aspect. And that's why we need to think like intersectionality. So the intersectionality is constructing a complex perspective than traditional perspective. And queer theory draws our attention to deconstructing the traditional perspective. So queer theory challenges the binary thinking of gender and the assumption that we understand womanhood or manhood in relation to their role within a heterosexual relationship. So queer research with international students not only tries to address the issue that LGBTQ+ students are largely invisible in research with international students, but also reminds us of interrogating the binary view of international students. Like queer sensitives enable us to think beyond here, there, west, east, global nouns, global for insider, outsider, and heterosexual and homosexual sex. So all in all, we need to challenge these stereotypes caused by binary, provide a platform for diverse experience of international students, and enable a more intersectional queer perspective on participants' life experience within universities. So the feminist epistemology calls for a revaluation of how we perceive and construct knowledge. I'll bridge the connection between the epistemology and conducting feminist research with international students. Thinking of methodological consideration for feminist international students research. So I have joined Van Wigginton and Fran's key methodological consideration for critical feminist research. So first of all, we need to question our research question. Whose interests are served in asking this question? Are they in the best interest of marginalized students, or do they justify the interests of dominant group of students? And second, we need to examine the discourse we imply in our research. Do the terms we imply carry a weight of dominant discourse, or are they more inclusive? Does our research allow for complexity and contradiction in students' experience? As for the methodology, do our research further consult or cooperate with marginalized international students? For example, consider using participatory research methods, like that. And the fourth consideration concerns the contributions. When doing research with international students, ask ourselves, how can our research transfer discourse around international students? How can we produce knowledge that resists rather than justifies the system of inequality and stereotypes toward international students? And last but not least, feminist reflexivity. This involves locating ourselves, the researcher, in the research process. How do our personal experience or identities, especially gender, shape the process of our research? Do we bring gendered assumption to our research? How do they impact the dynamic between marginalized international students and researcher and the ultimate funding of our research? To wrap up my presentation, let's conclude why we should embrace feminist approaches in international students research. Well, in general, feminist approaches identify the subordination of women and other marginalized international students and take action to overcome the subordination of them. So if we connect to the challenge we face, feminist approach identify where marginalized international students have been excluded, interrogate knowledge that has produced marginalized students as inferior or only significant when serving male or Western students and other intersectional power. Interrogate knowledge that reinforce social hierarchies in international higher education, and then center their experience and give them opportunities to speak and develop new theories and knowledge that disrupt social hierarchies in higher education.